In the summer of 2023, a restoration crew finally pried open the floorboards of the Weatherly Bend slave quarters in South Carolina. 3 men walked off the job that day and never came back. The wide pine planks had been nailed down in 1863, sealing the cabin for 160 years. One worker told a local reporter the floor made a sound when it opened. He said it sounded like something exhaling. Underneath those boards, packed into the crawl space beneath the cabin, was a collection of objects that the University of South Carolina's Archaeology Department has still not fully cataloged. Some of it was expected. Most of it was not. And one item, sealed inside a small clay jar wrapped in red thread, has not been photographed, has not been displayed. And according to the graduate student who first pulled it from the dirt, should not exist. Before we dive in, press subscribe and let us know where in the world you are watching from. Weatherly Bend sits about 40 miles inland from Charleston in a stretch of tidal lowland that the Gullah Geechee people have called the Shadow Country for as long as anyone can remember. The plantation was founded in 1798 by Josiah Weatherly, a second son from a Barbados sugar family who bought the land cheap after the previous owner drowned in his own irrigation canal. Weatherly grew rice. By 1850, the census recorded 146 enslaved men, women, and children living on the property, housed in a row of 11 cabins along the northern edge of the field, close enough that Weatherly could see the smoke from their chimneys, but far enough that he never had to smell the smoke from their cooking. The 10th cabin in that row is the one this story is about. It was smaller than the others, only about 12 feet by 16, and it sat slightly apart, separated by a narrow strip of packed earth. In the plantation records held at the South Caroliniana Library in Columbia, it is referred to as the isolation cabin. There is no explanation given for the name. There is no record of who lived in it. It appears on the property inventory of 1,841, and on every inventory after that, always as the isolation cabin, always without occupants listed. Dr. Alan Marsden, a historian at the College of Charleston, spent 3 years trying to figure out what the cabin was used for. He never got a clean answer. What he did find, buried in the letters of Josiah Weatherly's youngest daughter, Cordelia, was a single sentence written to her cousin in Savannah in the summer of 1848. She wrote that her father had again forbidden her from walking near the 10th cabin at night, that she had again heard the singing coming from inside it, and that she wished the woman would stop. Cordelia was 14 when she wrote that letter. She died the following winter of what the family doctor recorded as a fever. Her mother, Elizabeth Weatherly, died 6 months after that. Josiah himself lived until 1861, when he was found in his study with a self-inflicted gunshot wound to the head. The plantation was inherited by his surviving son, Thomas, who abandoned it within a year and moved north to Baltimore. When Union forces reached Weatherly Bend in early 1865, they found the main house empty, the fields overgrown, and the row of cabins still standing. All 11 of them, Every door was open, every cabin empty, except the 10th. That cabin's door was chained from the outside, and the windows had been boarded over with what one Union officer described in his field journal as an excessive amount of nails. He counted them. There were 412 nails driven into the boards covering the 2 small windows. The chain on the door was wrapped 7 times around the frame and secured with a padlock that had rusted shut. The officer, a lieutenant named Harlan Briggs from Ohio, ordered the door broken open. 2 of his men used a fence post as a battering ram. When the door finally gave way, Briggs wrote that a smell came out of the cabin that made one of his soldiers vomit immediately and made the other one refuse to enter. Briggs went in alone. He wrote that the interior of the cabin was completely empty. There was no furniture, no bedding, no personal belongings, and no sign that anyone had lived there in a long time. The floor was covered in a fine layer of gray dust, and in the center of the floor, drawn in what Briggs described as chalk or possibly ash, was a large circle with markings inside it that he did not recognize and did not attempt to copy into his journal. He wrote only that he found the markings disturbing, that he ordered his men to nail the door shut again from the outside, and that he did not include the cabin in his report to his commanding officer. In his personal journal, Briggs added that the cabin should be left alone. He felt watched the entire time he was inside it, and when he stepped out, he heard something behind him take a breath. Lieutenant Briggs died in 1889 in a veterans' hospital in Cleveland. His journal was donated to the Ohio Historical Society in 1954. It sat in a storage box for another 60 years before a graduate student named Rebecca Hollis came across it while researching Union troop movements in coastal South Carolina. She read the passage about the 10th cabin. She made a note of it. In 2019, she contacted the current owners of the Weatherly Bend property, a nonprofit historical trust that had purchased the land in 2011, with the intention of preserving it as a memorial site. She asked whether the 10th cabin still stood. They told her it did, that it had never been opened, that the chain Union soldiers had put on the door in 1865 was still there, and that no one on the current staff had any interest in removing it. That changed in 2022, when the Historical Trust received a grant from the National Endowment for the Humanities to conduct a full archaeological survey of the cabin row. The 10th cabin was included. The lead archaeologist, Dr. Miriam Vance, from the University of South Carolina, wrote in her grant proposal that the cabin represented an irreplaceable opportunity to document a piece of enslaved history that had been physically preserved by neglect. She acknowledged that oral histories from the local Gullah Geechee community had long identified the 10th cabin as a place that should not be entered, and that community leaders had asked the trust to leave it sealed. She proceeded anyway because, in her professional judgment, the historical value outweighed the concerns. Her team broke the chain on the door in June of 2023. The door had been nailed shut, as Briggs described, But the wood had also been reinforced from the inside at some point. Additional planks were nailed across the interior of the door frame. Planks that had not been mentioned in any historical record. The nails holding those planks were hand-forged and had been driven in from within the cabin. Someone had barricaded the door from the inside before it was chained from the outside. The interior of the cabin was almost exactly as Briggs had described it in 1865. Empty, dust-covered, and in the center of the floor, faintly visible under the accumulated dirt of a century and a half, was the circle. The markings inside it had faded, but were still legible. Dr. Vance photographed them and sent copies to 3 specialists in West African religious iconography, Gula spiritual practice, and colonial-era folk magic. All 3 responded within a week. All 3 said the same thing. The markings were not from any tradition they recognized. Not Congo cosmograms, not Islamic talismans brought over by enslaved Muslims from the Senegambian coast, not European hex signs or witch marks, something else. One specialist, Dr. Ade Melosu at Howard University, wrote back and asked Dr. Vance in a follow-up email whether she was absolutely certain the markings were made by human hands. Dr. Vance did not know how to answer. The floor came up in early July. The graduate students on the crew had been prepared for a difficult excavation. Rice plantation cabin sites in the South Carolina Low Country are notoriously waterlogged, and organic material tends to decompose quickly. The team expected to find fragments of bottle glass, a few pieces of ceramic, maybe some corroded iron nails and buttons. That is what they found in cabins 1 through 9. Cabin 10 was different from the first shovel down. The soil beneath the floorboards was dry. Not damp, not moist, dry. Dr. Vance later described it as feeling like the dust from an attic rather than the earth from a coastal marsh. The team measured the moisture content, and it was less than 4%. A level that should be physically impossible for soil in that region. At that depth, in that climate, the surrounding soil outside the cabin footprint tested at 31%. Something about the space under cabin 10 had kept the ground dry for 160 years, and no one on the team could explain how. The first artifact they recovered was a small iron nail bent into the shape of a cross. It was buried about 4 in down, directly beneath the center of the circle drawn on the floor above. Below that nail, at a depth of 6 in, they found a second nail bent the same way. Below that, a third. There were 11 bent nails in total, arranged in a vertical line descending straight down from the center of the circle. Below the 11th nail, at a depth of approximately 18 in, they found the first bone. It was small. It was a phalanx, a finger bone, and it belonged to a child of approximately 6 to 8 years old. The forensic anthropologist brought in to examine it estimated the bone was between 170 and 200 years old. There were no records of any child dying at Weatherly Bend during that period. The plantation's mortality records, which are surprisingly complete, list every death by name, age, cause, and burial location. The children who died on that plantation were buried in a small graveyard. On the western edge of the property, marked with wooden crosses that were replaced with stone in the 1920s by descendants. No child is missing from that list, and none are unaccounted for, the bones continued. Over the next 3 weeks, the excavation team recovered the partial remains of what forensic analysis would eventually identify as at least 14 separate individuals, all children ranging in age from approximately 3 years old to 12 years old. The bones were not laid out in any burial pattern. They were mixed with the soil, distributed unevenly, and in some cases wrapped in fragments of coarse woven cotton, consistent with the plain cloth issued to enslaved children on low-country plantations. Some fragments still carried traces of rusty brown staining. The lab confirmed the stains were blood, but the samples were too degraded to extract usable DNA, which meant the children could not be identified and could not be given back their names. Dr. Vance stopped sleeping around this point in the excavation. She has spoken publicly about it. Once the count passed 10 children, she began to feel that the cabin did not want them to be there. There were sounds at night that she could not explain, and slowly she came to understand why the Gula community had asked her to leave the site alone. She continued the excavation. She has said she regrets that decision. The objects buried alongside the bones were catalogued in 3 groups. The first group consisted of items that could plausibly be interpreted within known frameworks of African American folk religion. Nkisi bundles, which are Congo spiritual objects wrapped in cloth containing herbs, hair, and small personal items. Mojo bags, bottles filled with rusted nails and vinegar, sometimes called witch bottles, used in both African and European folk traditions to trap malevolent spirits. Iron horseshoes bent into unusual shapes, graveyard dirt in small paper twists that had somehow survived intact. Taken together, these items told a coherent story. Someone had been performing protective rituals in this cabin, sustained over many years, using materials drawn from multiple traditions blended in the Gula spiritual practice known as hoodoo. The archaeologists had questions, but they had frameworks for answering them. The second group was harder to explain. It consisted of 17 small carved figures made from heart pine treated with an unknown resin that had preserved them almost perfectly. The figures were roughly human-shaped, roughly 6 in tall, each bound with red thread wrapped many times around its body, each with a small piece of iron driven into its chest, each with its eyes gouged out. They were arranged in a rough circle facing outward, positioned around the perimeter of the space beneath the cabin. Dr. Nwosu flew down to see them in person and examined the figures for 2 days. In her report, she identified influences from Congo-Nkisi traditions, from Yoruba practices, from Vodun, and from other Western and Central African religious systems, but wrote that the figures did not conform to any single tradition, and the combination of elements was unprecedented in her experience. The figures appeared to be facing outward, as if standing guard, and in her professional opinion, The arrangement was defensive. Some things inside the space had been kept there. The figures were keeping it in. The third group consisted of a single item. It was a clay jar, roughly the size of a coffee cup, sealed with wax that had blackened and hardened over the centuries. The jar was wrapped in red thread, dyed with a mixture of pokeweed juice and human blood, and buried at the exact center of the circle formed by the 17 guardian figures, at a depth of approximately 3 feet, deeper than any of the other artifacts. It was the last thing recovered. The graduate student who lifted it out of the ground, Talia Reyes, later told a documentary crew that when her hand closed around the jar, she felt her ears pop as if the pressure in the room had suddenly changed. The jar was warm in a way that clay from cold, dry soil should not have been. She placed it in the padded transport case, and for the rest of the day, she felt as though someone was standing behind her, no matter which direction she faced. The jar was taken back to the university laboratory and scheduled for a controlled opening on the 14th of August, 2023, in a sterile environment with cameras and multiple specialists present. It did not happen. On the morning of August 12th, the laboratory's climate control system failed for reasons the maintenance staff were unable to determine. The temperature in the artifact storage room spiked to over 90 degrees Fahrenheit and remained there for 6 hours before the system was brought back online. When staff entered the storage room, they found that the wax seal on the jar had partially melted. The red thread wrapping it had unraveled on one side. The jar had cracked along its base, and something had leaked out onto the padded interior of the transport case. The substance was black, viscous, and had a smell that 2 of the 4 staff members present said made them feel physically ill. It was collected for analysis. The jar was resealed as best as could be managed and placed in a new container. Dr. Vance postponed the opening indefinitely. Lab analysis of the leaked substance was completed 3 weeks later and reported to Dr. Vance in a private meeting. The report has not been released publicly. What has been confirmed through anonymous sourcing to a journalist at the Post and Courier is that the substance contained biological material, cellular structures the lab's technicians could not identify, and trace amounts of what were tentatively identified as human proteins configured in ways that did not match any known human tissue type. It also contained an unclassified organic compound with a molecular structure that did not appear in any reference database available to the laboratory. The Post and Courier reporter asked Dr. Vance directly whether the substance was alive. He not answer. She ended the interview. The jar is currently held in a secure facility on the University of South Carolina campus. It has not been opened. The 17 guardian figures have been placed around it, arranged in the same defensive circle in which they were found. This was done at the request of Dr. Noatsu, and Dr. Vance agreed without argument. The bones of the 14 children have been reburied at the small graveyard on the western edge of the Weatherly Bend property, in a ceremony conducted by Gullah spiritual leaders from the surrounding community. Dr. Vance had asked that they be given proper names, but no names could be recovered. So, the graves are marked only with the words, "A child of this place." There are 14 of them. They face east toward the rising sun. The 10th cabin has been sealed again, the door has been replaced, and new chains placed on it. At the request of the community, a small group of elders came out to the site and performed a ceremony before the door was closed. Nobody has explained what the ceremony consisted of, and no recording of it has been released. Dr. Vance was present. She has said only that she stood outside while it happened and that she felt, for the first time since the excavation began, that whatever had been inside the cabin was finally at rest. Whether that feeling is accurate, she does not know. She has said she hopes it is. There are still questions no one has answered. Who were the 14 children buried under the floor? Who put them there? What ritual required their bones? Who was the woman? Cordelia Weatherly heard singing in 1848. And why did Josiah Weatherly forbid his daughter from going near the cabin at night? What is inside the jar? Why did someone barricade the door from the inside, then chain it from the outside, and then leave it alone for 6 generations? What did Lieutenant Briggs hear behind him when he stepped out of that cabin in 1865? The historical record does not answer these questions. Neither does the archaeological record. The oral tradition of the Gula Geechee community offers something that might be an answer, but the elders have declined to share it with outside researchers, and their reasons are their own. What can be said is this: the 10th cabin at Weatherly Bend was not just a slave quarter. It was something else, something that people who lived and died at that plantation understood, and something they went to extraordinary lengths to contain. 14 children were buried under the floor. 17 guardian figures were placed to hold something in. A jar was sealed with blood and thread. Doors were nailed and chained. Generations passed. When a team of researchers finally opened the space, they did not find answers. They found more questions, one leaking jar, and a feeling many of them have said they cannot describe and would prefer not to remember. The cabin is sealed now. Perhaps it should stay that way. Perhaps some floorboards were nailed down for a reason. And perhaps the safest thing any of us can do when we come across a door that has been chained shut for 160 years is to leave it alone.